The letter sat on my kitchen counter like a time bomb, the bold red, "Immediate action required," stamped across the top, practically daring me to open it. I stared at it for a good 30 seconds, coffee mug warm in my hand, before finally tearing the envelope clean down the middle. The first thing that hit me was the smell of cheap toner ink, the kind you'd expect from a second-rate office printer. The second thing that hit me was the number, big, bold, black, staring me dead in the face. Total due, $250,000. For a second, I honestly thought it had to be a joke. Maybe a typo. Maybe someone in the HOA office had fat-fingered a number while inputting fines. But as my eyes scanned the sheet, line after line of so-called violations scrolled past my vision, each one more ridiculous than the last. Unauthorized modification of landscaping, unapproved fencing and perimeter structures, operating commercial equipment in a residential zone, failure to submit proper renovation permits. I let the letter fall to the counter and just stood there in the silence of my kitchen, staring at the crumpled paper while the hum of the refrigerator filled the room. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a setup I'd kept to myself since buying the ranch a few years ago. My nearest neighbor was nearly a mile down the road, and I liked it that way. Wide open space, quiet mornings, and the occasional whinny of my horses, that's all I wanted. But lately, the HOA had been getting nosier. First it was the letters about my non-conforming mailbox. Then it was, "Your exterior lights don't match the neighborhood standard." And now they wanted $250,000 for nonsense violations that didn't even apply to me. What made this whole thing hilarious, almost laughable, if I wasn't so pissed, was that the HOA had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought I was just some guy who'd lucked into owning a big slice of land at the edge of their development. They thought they could bully me, fine me into submission, maybe even push me to sell. But here's the thing. I didn't just own my ranch. I owned the very ground their million-dollar homes were sitting on. The entire neighborhood, from the cul-de-sacs lined with imported palm trees to the little man-made lake they were so proud of, sat on land that had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather had leased it to developers in the late 70s with one simple clause in the contract: the land stayed ours. They could build, they could sell, they could play house with their little HOA board and write as many rules as they wanted, but none of it changed the fact that they were standing on property they didn't own. For decades, I never said a word. I didn't raise the lease fees, didn't interfere in their meetings, didn't bother them as long as they didn't bother me. But this letter, this was different. By the time I drained my coffee mug, I'd already made up my mind. The HOA held their board meetings every Thursday evening in their little clubhouse, a ridiculous faux colonial building with white pillars and a marble fountain that had cost them nearly $80,000 in improvements last year. My lawyer had laughed when I showed him the fine letter, but he didn't laugh when I laid the original lease documents on his desk. The ink may have been faded, but the terms were clear: my land, my rules. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. When the day finally arrived, I pulled up in my old black pickup, parking it squarely in front of the clubhouse just as the sun started to dip below the horizon. The fountain out front burbled like it had a right to be there, the water catching the golden light in an almost mocking way. I could see through the tall glass doors that the meeting was already in full swing. Karen, the HOA president, self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, was at the podium, her platinum blonde bob perfectly coiffed, her manicured nails flashing as she waved her hands dramatically. Her voice carried even before I opened the door, sharp and nasal as she rattled off something about upcoming landscaping inspections and new restrictions on driveway decor. The room fell silent the moment I stepped inside. I didn't wait for an invitation. Didn't wait for anyone to acknowledge me. I walked straight down the aisle between the rows of plastic folding chairs, the folder of documents tucked under my arm. Karen's eyes narrowed when she saw me, her perfectly lined lips twisting into a smirk that made my blood run hot. "Oh," she said, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. "Mr. Thompson, here to discuss your outstanding violations." I stopped at the front of the room, just a few feet from the podium, and set the folder down on the table with a quiet, deliberate thump. "No," I said, my voice calm, almost casual. "I'm here to discuss your violations." A ripple of confusion spread through the room. Whispers broke out among the seated board members and a few of the homeowners who'd bothered to show up. Karen blinked, then laughed, that awful, grating laugh that always seemed one octave too high. "Excuse me," she said, "you're the one in violation. If you don't pay your fines within 30 days, we'll be filing a lien on your land." I cut in, letting the word hang heavy in the air. Karen froze for just a second. A tiny crack in her perfect mask. "This isn't a joke, Mr. Thompson," she snapped. "This is HOA property. This clubhouse, these roads, this entire community." I pulled the first document from the folder and held it up for the room to see. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still perfectly legible. "Wrong," I said, my voice steady and sharp. "This entire neighborhood, every cul-de-sac, every inch of asphalt, every blade of grass around your precious little lake, sits on my land. My family never sold it. You've been leasing it for decades. And I've been generous enough not to raise a fuss." Gasps filled the room. One of the older board members, Howard, I think his name was, leaned forward, his glasses sliding down his nose as he squinted at the document in my hand. That's impossible," Karen stammered, but her voice had lost its edge. Howard stood, his face pale as paper. He's right," he muttered. "I've heard about this. My father told me the land was never sold outright. It's leased." He turned to Karen. "Everything we've built here, it's on his property." The color drained from Karen's face. I leaned a little closer to her, my smile cold and sharp. "Effective immediately," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm terminating the existing lease agreement. You have 30 days to negotiate a new contract, or vacate the premises." Chaos erupted. People shouted, some in panic, some in disbelief. Karen sputtered, clutching her clipboard like it was a lifeline, but I didn't let the noise get to me. "You think you can fine me for using my own land?" I continued, raising my voice just enough to be heard over the din. "Not anymore. I've watched you bully good people for years, nickel and dime your neighbors, and now you think you can extort me for $250,000. Those days are over." Karen finally found her voice, but it came out shaky, desperate. You can't do this," she said. "We'll sue you." I leaned forward, close enough for her to see the steel in my eyes. "Go ahead," I said softly. "But when you do, I'll remind the court that your little HOA has been trespassing and extorting the legal landowner for decades. Let's see how that plays out." The room was dead silent after that. The silence in the clubhouse didn't last long. As soon as I turned on my heel and walked toward the exit, the noise hit me like a tidal wave, frantic voices rising, some in disbelief, others in outright panic. Chairs scraped across the polished tile floor, the sound of hurried footsteps echoing as a few board members chased after me, their voices desperate, pleading. "Wait, Mr. Thompson, we can talk about this," one of them shouted. I didn't slow down. My boots thudded against the wooden steps outside as I headed for my truck. The night air was cooler now, carrying that crisp smell of pine from the nearby woods. The porch lights of the clubhouse flickered behind me, the glow casting sharp shadows across the asphalt of the parking lot. I climbed into my truck, the leather seat creaking under me, and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. The adrenaline was still buzzing in my veins, sharp and hot. They had no idea who they'd been messing with. When I first got that $250,000 fine, I'd almost laughed it off, chalking it up to Karen and her little committee trying to flex what little power they thought they had. But standing there tonight, seeing the color drain from her face when I laid out the truth, that this land, this entire carefully manicured neighborhood, was mine, that was something else entirely. By the time I rolled out of the parking lot, I'd already made up my mind. I wasn't done. The next morning, I was up before the sun, coffee in hand, and a stack of old legal documents spread across my kitchen table. My grandfather had kept everything, contracts, maps, correspondence, and I knew every line of those agreements by heart. The developers had signed leases that were generous for the time, a percentage of profits from each home sale funneled back to us annually, plus minimal yearly land rent. They'd assumed, of course, that they'd eventually buy the land outright. But they never did. I called my lawyer, Richard, just after 7. He'd been with my family for years, a sharp guy with a knack for detail and a ruthless streak when someone crossed the line. "They really stepped in it this time," he said, his voice crackling through the phone speaker. "You're within your rights to terminate the lease entirely. In fact, considering the bogus fines and the harassment, we could make a strong case for damages if you wanted to go that route." "Not yet," I said, sipping my coffee slowly. "I don't want their money. I want control. They've been running this place like they own it, bullying neighbors, fining people for things as small as leaving trash cans out too long. It stops now." Richard chuckled darkly. "Then we hit them where it hurts. Control the land, you control everything." That afternoon, I drafted a formal notice of lease termination. It was professional, clean, and impossible to dispute. Richard reviewed it, added a few sharp legal points, and by evening, it was delivered, certified mail, to every single member of the HOA board. By the next morning, my phone was blowing up. Calls from unknown numbers, voicemails filled with frantic voices, emails, some polite, some outright hostile, all begging for a discussion. I ignored most of them, instead spending my day out by the lake, letting my horses graze along the banks while I planned my next move. By the end of the week, the HOA had called an emergency meeting, and this time, I made sure I wasn't just showing up empty-handed. When I arrived, the clubhouse was packed. Not just the board members but dozens of homeowners, some angry, some confused, all of them desperate for answers. Karen sat at the front of the room again, her perfect hair a little less perfect this time, her eyes shadowed from what I imagined was a week of restless nights. "Mr. Thompson," she said the moment I stepped inside, her tone clipped but strained. "We need to talk, privately." I didn't bother hiding my smirk as I walked to the front. "No, Karen," I said, my voice carrying across the room. "We're going to talk right here. Everyone in this room deserves to know exactly what's going on." The murmurs grew louder, a ripple of agreement passing through the crowd. I pulled a stack of papers from my leather folder and set them on the podium with a sharp thud. "For decades," I began, "this neighborhood has operated on a lease that my grandfather signed with the original developers. That lease gave you the right to build your homes, pave your roads, even put up that ridiculous fountain out front. But here's the thing, you never owned the land. Not then, not now." Gasps echoed through the room. I scanned the crowd, letting my words sink in. "This week, you decided to fine me $250,000 for supposed violations on land that's mine. That was your mistake, and now, I've decided it's time for a change." Karen stood abruptly, her voice sharp and desperate. "You can't just take everything from us. People have families here, investments." "Then maybe you should have read your contracts," I interrupted, my tone calm but cutting. "Effective immediately, the HOA no longer has authority over any property in this neighborhood. All fines, all enforcement, all so-called violations, null and void. From now on, if there are rules, they'll be fair, transparent, and they'll come from me." The room exploded into chaos. Some people cheered, others shouted questions. Karen's face turned an angry shade of red as she sputtered about legal action and court orders, but her voice was drowned out by the tide of voices around her. I let it roll over me, waiting for a lull before continuing. "You all have been living under a dictatorship," I said, my voice quieter now but still firm. "You've been bullied, fined, and harassed by a board that thought they held all the power. That ends today. From this point forward, I'll be restructuring how things work here. Reasonable rules, agreed upon by the people who actually live here, not a handful of power-hungry individuals." One man in the back stood up, his face lined with years but his eyes bright with cautious hope. "So what happens now?" I smiled. "Now," I said, "we start fresh. Together." It took weeks to untangle the mess the HOA had made. Years of poorly kept records, funds misallocated to pet projects, and fines that had been illegally collected. It was a disaster. But with Richard's help, and with the support of more neighbors than I'd ever expected, we started rebuilding. Karen fought me at every turn. She filed complaints, hired lawyers, even tried to rally the neighborhood against me. But every time, she lost. The contracts were ironclad, the land was mine, and the homeowners, once too afraid to speak up, now saw her for what she really was, a bully who'd finally been knocked off her throne. The day the fountain out front was dismantled was the day I knew we'd truly won. I stood there in the early morning light, watching as the workers, hired by me, paid for with funds I'd reclaimed from the HOA's bloated accounts, hauled away the marble monstrosity that had cost the community tens of thousands of dollars. It felt like a fresh start. By summer, the neighborhood was different, friendlier. Without the constant fear of fines and harassment, people started enjoying their homes again. Kids played in the streets, neighbors hosted barbecues, and for the first time since I'd moved here, it actually felt like a community. And Karen, she moved. Sold her house and left in a huff, muttering about unreasonable landlords and hostile environments. I didn't shed a tear when her moving truck pulled out of the neighborhood. As I stood on the edge of my ranch one evening, the sun dipping low over the lake and the sound of laughter drifting from a backyard barbecue down the road, I couldn't help but smile. They'd tried to fine me for living my life on my own land. Now, they knew better.